Hello, dear viewers. I am a global nationalist. I support nationalism in India and all countries around the globe. Today, I want to talk about a historic issue, event that now. It is the decided truckers in Canada as part of the freedom. I want to talk about that and compare that to the farmers that happened in India in 2020. So, yeah, Indian farmers protests. Let me show begin. First, I want to talk about the truckers' protests. The protest began because on January 15th, the Canadian government enforced the vaccination requirements, which applies to truckers who are entering Canada at the international border crossings. Since January 15th, unvaccinated American cross border truckers have been denied entry to Canada. Canadian truckers who are not fully vaccinated have to show proof of a negative PCR test collected within 72 hours of arriving at the border. They also need to quarantine after arrival. Unvaccinated Canadian truckers can still work in Canada unless their individual employer requires vaccination. As of January 5th, the federal government had announced plans for vaccine mandate for federally regulated domestic fleets that cross provincial borders. At that time, no final date was set for these rules. A reciprocal vaccination requirement for the cross-border trucking industry has been in place since January 22nd, when the United States enforced theirs. Uh, Unvaccinated Canadian truckers are denied entry to the United States, and so the protests were against these vaccine requirements introduced by the government of Canada. Basically, they are against the mandate that says that they have to be vaccinated to enter, or else they have to remain in quarantine for within 72 hours of arriving at the border, and they need to quarantine after arrival, and that they have to take a negative PCR test. They're against that. They want to be able to re-enter Canada at will and without any vaccines, because they believe that this is restricting the freedom of Canadian truckers who are unvaccinated, because it's pressurizing them and forcing them to get vaccinated. And I agree with them. This is a forceful vaccination, and I am against forced vaccinations, as is the Indian government. Here, we can see that the Indian government told the Supreme Court that it has not issued any guideline that envisages vaccination without consent or makes a vaccination certificate mandatory for any purpose. In an affidavit filed on January 13th, the Union Ministry of Health and Family Welfare said that no person can be forced to be vaccinated against their wishes. I support this, and I'm glad that the Indian government has given the uh, Indian people the choice to get vaccinated or not to get vaccinated. And as per me, I do not want to tell the viewer whether they should or should not get vaccinated. It's a medical decision, and this is not a channel that discusses medical topics, so I don't want to talk about that particularly. I just want to talk about the legal and political ramifications of the issue. Now, here is the Indian farmers' protest from 2020 to 2021. The 2020 to 2021 Indian farmers' protests were a protest against three farm acts that were passed by the Parliament of India in September 2020. The acts, often called the Farm Bills, have been described as anti farmer laws by many farmer unions and politicians from the opposition who say it would leave farmers at the mercy of corporates. And here is one of the laws passed. It's called the Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Promotion and Facilitation Act 2020. It was an act to provide for the creation of an ecosystem where the farmers and traders enjoy the freedom of choice relating to sale and purchase of farmers' produce, which facilitates remunerative prices through competitive alternative trading channels to promote efficient, transparent, and barrier free interstate and intrastate trade and commerce of farmers' produce outside the physical premises of markets or deemed markets notified under various state agricultural produce market legislations. So, what this means is that this law allows farmers and traders to sell and buy the farmers' produce respectively without having to go through the deemed markets that have been notified under various state agriculture market legislations. These are basically APMCs, which are basically markets that are which the government allows to buy and sell produce. And the problem with them is, according to the government, that they would often take advantage of the farmers because the farmers could only sell through them to the other traders, and so they would take bribes from the farmers. They would uh, take other corrupt practices, and because they had a monopoly over the system. And so this law aims to break that monopoly by allowing farmers and traders to buy and sell directly to each other. And here it says that any farmer or trader or electronic trading and transaction platform shall have the freedom to carry on the interstate or intrastate trade and commerce and farmers' produce in a trade area. Any trader may engage in the intrastate trade or intrastate trade or scheduled farmers' produce with a farmer or another trader in a trade area. Now, the difference between this and Canada's vaccine mandate are basically that this provides freedom to the farmers and thereby to the Indian people at large, while the vaccine mandate of the Canadian government it restricts freedom of the Canadian truckers. That's one. The second point is that the um, requirements that were issued on January 15th were not legislation. They were orders from the government. Therefore, they have not yet been passed in Parliament. Therefore, naturally, their constitutionality and legality are questionable. However, this is an act of Parliament that was passed, and so it was not purely executive action and has more legitimacy than executive order like the Canadian government made. And so I want to talk about the farmers' protests. Many people in India um, had different opinions about these farmer protests. The important point to know about this is that most of the farmers in these protests were from Punjab and some were from Haryana. Here, as it says here, mainly from Punjab and Haryana. And while there were farm unions from other states, it was mainly from these two. However, the Freedom Convoy, the truckers' convoy, is from different states: Ottawa, Alberta, Ontario, and so it's much more widespread and has support of most Canadians actually. If you see online, especially on YouTube comment sections about the truckers' protests, almost all the comments by Canadians are positive. And another important difference is that the farmers' protests in India did get violent at times. They were not always violent. They were generally peaceful, but they did have incidents of violence. For example, here on uh, December 28, 2020, it was reported by the Hindustan Times that farmers protesters damaged over 1,500 telecom towers in Punjab. So far, there has not been any destruction of private or public property by the truckers in Canada. They have been accused of uh, what was it, kind of disfiguring or sacrileging the war memorial of Canada of the fallen soldier. However, that has not been proven beyond doubt, and that was not that's not agreed to by the truckers. They don't believe that, and even so, they meant the disrespect that they're referring to is merely that somebody either um, danced in front of it or urinated on it or something like that. Nothing destructive. The monument is still there. The memorial is still intact, but these telecom towers were actually damaged and attacked deliberately. So there is a difference. So that's defacing of the unknown soldier's tomb is the only real violence that the trucker protests have been accused of so far. It's been almost a month that they've been protesting, and this had happened by the time within 2 months of the protests, and so perhaps within next month there might be some violence by the Canadian truckers, but it's unlikely because so far there has not been any violence. Now, um, here, Op India wrote an article about the entire protest, and they explained what the impact of the protests were. They say it says here, and I agree, that the primary aim was not to get the government to repeal the farm laws, but to hold the center to ransom and blackmail them into acquiescence on as many demands as possible. This can be seen that Rakesh Tikait, one of the leaders of the farmers' protests, alleged that if additional demands made by the farmers are not met, then 60 tractors will march towards Parliament on November 29th, the day when Parliament is to commence. This is a threat to the parliamentarians. and he demanded the center to pass legislation on MSP guarantee, withdrawal of criminal cases against lumpen farmer protests, seed bill, pesticides bill, amongst other things. This is clearly uh, not proper. This is not how a democracy can function, a government can function by almost mob rule. It's not democratic. And so far, the truckers are not demanding anything for the government to do. They're simply asking for the government to withdraw the mandate. So there is a difference there. Now, um, so that's the difference between the truckers' protests and the farmers' protests. Basically, the truckers' protests is disciplined, peaceful, and proper, and not violent. And farmers' protests were violent and were not always peaceful and did damage property and were generally very political. And they were, another point to mention is that they were funded and supported by Khalistanis. Khalistan is a movement, a terrorist movement in India to create a separate nation for Sikhs in India that comprises of the Indian state of Punjab and other states. It's a banned or movement, and the truckers' protests is, as far as I know, not being supported by any terrorist organization in Canada. Is not demanding separatism for any province, even though there I acknowledge that there is a separatist sentiment in the western provinces of Canada, Alberta and Saskatchewan, but that is not what is fueling these protests. Therefore, that's also another difference. And the reason why I've made this video, this comparison, is because there seems to be a miscommunication and a misunderstanding between Indians and Canadians on this topic. Because during the farmer protests, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau spoke in support of the farmers' protests, not deliberately against the laws, but in support of the protests, and saying that he supports peaceful protests, which irked India because obviously the Indian government doesn't want foreign countries to be commenting on India's internal affairs. And actually, the Indian government protested Prime Minister Trudeau's statements. And now that Trudeau himself is facing protests, many Indians believe that this is karma. And I agree that this is karma, but not exactly, because the farmers that were protesting against Modi were uh, not always peaceful. They were not protesting for a very valid reason, and they were often violent and thuggish. And so there was actually it was wrong morally for any even if you ignore the fact that it's an internal matter of India, it was still incorrect for the prime minister to support these protesters because they had rioted on several occasions, such as on January 26th of 2021 when they invaded the capital city of Delhi and attacked police officers and other people. But the truckers' protest has been peaceful entirely. People have been cheering, singing patriotic songs, uh, doing, supporting the communities, keeping the streets clean. So, what I think the misunderstanding I see from Indians is that the truckers' protests should be condemned, just like the Indians' farmer protests were. But I disagree. I think that the truckers' protest should be supported. I think they're doing the right thing. And I am glad that Trudeau is facing some karma, but it's not exact karma because the protests he supported were violent and wrong, while the protests against him are peaceful and correct. Therefore, it's not perfect karma. And as far as I understand karma to be, and I think Canadians are seeing some opposition to Justin Trudeau on this, giving they see that Indians are supporting the truckers' protest, and they are thinking that the Indians are genuinely aware of the situation and genuinely oppose vaccine mandates in Canada, which is incorrect. The many Indians who are supporting the truckers convoy, the Freedom Convoy, are doing so sarcastically and are not genuine. So that's a misunderstanding from the Canadian side. So, yeah, and I hope that for both Canadians and Indians, that this video will give you some insight into the two protests that happened in our countries. And yeah, that's what I wanted to say. If you want to see more videos on this playlist about historic events, please click here. If you want to see my previous video, click here. If you want to see the links that I used for as sources for this video, click in the description below. Thank you for watching. Vande Mataram.